Around July to August, we see the same kind of stories pop up in the news year after year. Utterly catastrophic footage of wildfires engulfing the western United States. Last year, wildfires got dangerously close to the Getty Museum, and the largest wildfires in California consumed over 77,000 acres in Sonoma County. So it feels like any day there should be some kind of headline saying, like, this is the worst wildfire season we've had on record. But in the United States, we're nowhere even close to the worst fires or the worst wildfire season on record. But why aren't we experiencing the worst wildfire season on record when the past 5 years have been the hottest ones on record? And oh goodness, what were those fire seasons like? I worry that a lot of media coverage portrays wildfire as something that's new to the continent, a problem that starts and ends with climate change, when that's really not the case. In my last video, I talked about the role that wildfire plays in various North American ecosystems. In this video, I want to talk about what can happen when we start toying with those natural fire regimes. These are the highs, and in the next video, I'm going to talk about the lows. Now, I want to disclaim, this isn't going to be some kind of, we've had it worse, so quit complaining about the forest fires kind of video. We do need some fire, but the big boys that we're going to be talking about in this video got way out of hand. Boys will be boys. In part, I think wildfire history is kind of inspirational, because it shows the resilience of our forests. So what were those worst wildfire seasons on record, and what parallels do we see in wildfire seasons today? Well, wildfire behavior has changed a ton in the past couple of centuries, and that owes largely to changes in available fuel and to fire regimes. And those owe largely to changes in human interaction. To understand why wildfires have gotten so much worse over the past couple of decades, we need to understand fire history, and in order to do that, we need to start at the beginning. Indigenous people have been stewards of the landscape since time immemorial. Lots of tribes, especially in the West, use fire to prevent fuels from building up or to manage a variety of habitats within their Aboriginal territories. Some tribes, like the Haudenosaunee in the Northeast, the Cherokee in the Southeast, and the Mandan and Hidatsa in the Great Plains, use fire to clear land for agriculture. The Shenandoah Valley was actually an open field when European colonists arrived for the first time. Other tribes use fire to open mosaic habitats that produce a variety of traditional foods. The Confederated Salish in the northern Rockies, for instance, use fire to open edge habitats suitable for xlo, xhosum, or salak, which are all important traditional foods. Prior to European settlement, the Confederated Salish actually set fires at twice the rate that would naturally occur. Fire also has rangeland uses. Plains tribes like the Blackfeet also used fire to corral bison into drive lines. So all of this profoundly altered the landscape that European settlers encountered. The American bison, which we typically think of as a plains species, actually used to range as far east as Pennsylvania because there was just that much more prairie. Early accounts from explorers and fur trappers often mention burned over or cleared areas littering the landscape. So the continent that Europeans landed on wasn't one where nature was just let to run its course, but rather one that had been intensively managed by native people living in this natural area. Look! Look at the vast, profoundly altered American landscape! Look at the vast, carefully cultivated wilderness! Additionally, a lot of tribes maintained their traditional burning practices until, like, the 30s, when the Forest Service became a sovereignty-ignoring party pooper. So wildfire history in the United States is really strongly connected to treaty making and who settled where. Europe, on the other hand, has a very different relationship to fire. European forests are pretty anomalous compared with the rest of the world because they don't really have a huge fire presence as a disturbance regime. So while Native Americans have a ton of traditional uses for fire, in Europe, forest fire was primarily used to clear land for either agriculture or for rangeland uses. So early colonial settlement didn't have strong active suppression efforts, but when colonists invaded tribal land, they curtailed a lot of indigenous burning, and that in itself had a huge impact on the landscape, and a lot of forests closed in. I really like Professor Joanne Freeman's lecture series on the American Revolution, and one of her gripes that really resonated with me is that we tend to condense a huge section of time into just early American history. And I think we tend to do this when we conceptualize the American landscape, too. We tend to canonize what the landscape looked like at the Industrial Revolution and then just kind of like project that image backwards. The amount of time between the American Revolution and the settling of Jamestown is the same amount of time between the American Revolution and World War II. A lot changed in the landscape over that period of time. So a homogeneous image of natural up until the Industrial Revolution is just inaccurate. European settlers reduced the role of fire on the landscape, but they increased the role of timber harvesting. Wood has always played an important role in American society, both because of the patriarchy and because it was the main building material for nearly everything in American and European society. Wood was also the main energy source until around 1870. I just want big sturdy wood to keep me warm. So logging was a major industry in North America since the beginning of European settlement. Even by 1790, New England was exporting 36 million board feet of timber per year. Europe had basically gone full Onceler at this point and depleted most of its forests, so you couldn't source ship-grade lumber from Western Europe. And just how are you going to colonize if you can't build any ships? So most of that wood came from North America. Logging really accelerated in the mid-1800s. The United States bought up a ton of land in the West and wanted to shift as much of that land into private ownership as possible. The federal government really wanted people to homestead out west, and this was reflected in a lot of popular songs in the day. As a result, public land was super cheap. But land was so cheap that logging companies could easily buy a plot of land, clear-cut the forest, and then use the timber profits to move on and buy more land. One common method of lumber harvesting at the time was to strip off all the tree branches in place and, that's it. You just leave them on the forest floor. This led to large swaths of what's now called trash land. I talked about the role of available fuel in my last video. And if you don't remember, available fuel is just any live or dead material that can be ignited. Well, big old discarded branches left to dry in the summer sun. Those are some available fuels, you know. That's some of them. So what were the worst wildfire seasons in United States history? Well, most of the summers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Mismanaged logging slash also played a major role in causing the Hinckley and Cloquet fires in northern Minnesota. I think Hinckley and Cloquet are wild because, I'm from Minnesota originally, and we never have wildfires there anymore. Other wildfire disasters owe to increased sources of ignition. A mismanaged burn ignited the 1871 Peshtigo fire in Door County, Wisconsin. It was actually the same day as the Chicago fire, and a lot of the monuments in the city are really salty about, constantly getting upstaged because more people know about Chicago. Peshtigo remains the deadliest wildfire in the United States and killed over 1,200 people. The entire town burned to the ground in less than an hour. Shortly after the church-going people had returned from the evening service, an ominous sound was heard, like the distant roar of the sea. A bright light appeared in the southwest horizon, gradually increasing till the heavens were aglow with light. A few moments elapsed before the horrible tornado of fire came upon the people, and enveloped them in flame, smoke, burning sand, and cinders. No tongue can tell, no pen can describe, no brush can depict the realities of that night. Sparks from railroads could also ignite nearby vegetation and were an extremely common cause of wildfire. Yale professor Ralph C. Hawley even wrote in 1923, "It is common knowledge that in the United States, steam railroads are one of the principal causes of forest fires." In 1910, a drought in the Idaho Panhandle caused Rocky Mountain forests to become extremely dry. Railroad sparks in northern Idaho ignited some fires, and strong winds grew that system to more than 3 million acres, about 1 Connecticut in size. Smoke from the fire covered the skies as far as Boston. The blaze was called the Big Blow-Up, and this became the largest wildfire in United States history. At the time, the Forest Service was only 5 years old and really wasn't equipped to deal with, the biggest wildfire the United States has ever had. The army was called in, and the arrival of the Buffalo Soldiers doubled the black population in Idaho. A lot of towns were just destroyed. This photo is of Wallace, about a third of which was destroyed. I've actually been through Wallace. It's better now. So now you know the largest wildfire in American history. Now you can pull that out at pub trivia night, or dismiss your friends who are complaining about the Amazon or Australia burning, because the early 20th century was just so much worse. Don't do this. But why should they listen to you? The management problems of 1910 are substantially different from the management problems now. But are they? On the one hand, we've done a great job regulating loggers to not just leave large piles of timber lying around, and railroads are no longer a main source of ignition. But railroads and logging slash didn't just all of a sudden get worse in 1910. What made 1910 unique was heat and drought. The big blowup is a sobering reminder of what can happen at the intersection of hazardous climatic conditions and poor management. And those hazardous climatic conditions are becoming more common. Additionally, while railroads aren't a huge source of ignition anymore, we're kind of having the same conversation about power lines as a source of ignition now. Pacific Gas and Electric, which you might have heard of as PG&E in the news, has admitted to faulty equipment causing numerous wildfires in California, including the 2018 Camp Fire, which is the deadliest wildfire in California state history. We were actually pretty successful at regulating railroads, and a lot of companies even employed their own fire crews. So I found these great meeting minutes from the Railway Fire Protection Association annual meeting in 1920, and there's this great section called The Moral Hazard, which I just want to share. Quote, "A flagrant moral hazard, for example, is where our unsuccessful farmer or merchant decides to get even with fate by committing arson. On railroads, the term can be said to include damage from carelessness on the part of all classes and lack of responsibility. The pump man rarely seen by his super may become careless. There is a fault on the part of the employer." These are people in the railroad industry basically saying negligence is arson. So yeah, electric companies need to do better, or we should regulate the sparks out of them. I think fire history is important because it lets us learn from catastrophe before we make the same mistakes again. 1910 wasn't even the country's worst wildfire season overall, but the big blowup is what really launched wildfire into the national discourse, as it became apparent that the Forest Service really didn't have the resources to combat the increasing threat of wildfires. The actual worst fire season in US history came in 1924 and burned over 100 million acres. Just to put this into context, the Amazon fires in 2019 burned 2.2 million acres, and the 2019-2020 Australia bushfire season burned around 46 million acres. The big blowup and other really awful fire seasons in the early 20th century really bolstered public support for the National Forest Service. Maybe it's time we start that conversation again. Now, the strategies we tried in the early and mid-20th century had a lot of problems, and I'll talk about those next time, but I'm really curious where this new global discourse on fire ecology will lead. That's about where I'm going to leave it now, but if you think that we've departed from pre-industrial fire regimes with railroads and logging slash, they're about to get absolutely destroyed when we talk about fire suppression and climate change in the late 20th century. If you like this, like, comment, subscribe. I make videos about ecology and conservation history. I have one more video that I want to do on fire suppression, and then I want to do a series on public lands in the United States, starting with dispossession in public lands. Yeah, thank you so much for hanging out with me tonight, and I hope to see you again real soon. Bye!